In the spring of 1917, the United States entered the First World War with a serious problem. The nation had soldiers, factories, railroads, and money. What it did not have was a population united behind the conflict. For nearly 3 years, President Woodrow Wilson had promised to keep America out of the European War. Millions of Americans had supported that position. German Americans maintained emotional connections to the country of their ancestors. Irish Americans often distrusted Britain. Labor organizers feared that workers would die while industrialists became richer. Farmers in the Midwest saw little reason to send their sons across the Atlantic. Then, almost overnight, the government asked the American people to reverse their position. The war could not be fought with weapons alone. It had to be sold. That urgent need would help shape the career of a young man named Edward Bernays. Bernays was born in Vienna in 1891 and moved to the United States with his family, while still a child. He grew up in New York City, surrounded by the energy of a country transforming itself into an industrial and cultural power. His family connections were unusual. Bernays was related to Sigmund Freud, the Austrian neurologist whose theories about unconscious desires would eventually influence how Bernays thought about crowds, consumers, and human behavior. But Bernays did not begin his career as a psychologist. He studied agriculture at Cornell University, graduating in 1912. His father expected him to enter the grain business, a respectable profession offering stability and a predictable future. Bernays had different ambitions. He was far more interested in newspapers, theater, publicity, and the invisible forces that made certain ideas suddenly capture public attention. In New York, he found himself working around medical publications and the entertainment industry. One of his earliest successes involved promoting a controversial play dealing with sexually transmitted disease. At a time when respectable society avoided discussing such subjects publicly, Bernays helped transform the production from a potentially scandalous performance into a serious social cause. The method was revealing. Instead of simply advertising the play, he surrounded it with authority. He connected the production to doctors, reformers, and respected members of society. The public was not merely being invited to buy a theater ticket. Audiences were being told that attending the performance was an act of education and civic responsibility. This became one of Bernays's central discoveries. People often resisted direct persuasion, but they responded differently when a message appeared to come from an independent expert, a respected institution, or a broader social movement. He was not selling the object itself. He was selling the meaning around it. When the United States declared war on Germany in April 1917, the federal government created the Committee on Public Information. Led by journalist George Creel, the committee became an enormous national communication machine. It produced posters, films, pamphlets, news releases, speeches, and carefully constructed stories designed to strengthen support for the war. The committee did not describe its work simply as propaganda. It presented its mission as public information. Yet its purpose was unmistakable: influence how Americans understood the conflict, how they viewed the enemy, and how they interpreted their own participation in the war. Creel's organization recruited writers, artists, journalists, advertising professionals, and publicists. Its messages appeared in movie theaters, schools, workplaces, churches, and newspapers. Volunteer speakers delivered short patriotic addresses to audiences across the country. Images portrayed American soldiers as defenders of civilization while presenting Germany as a threat to democracy and human freedom. The campaign demonstrated something that would remain with Bernays for the rest of his life. Modern society could mobilize millions of people through coordinated communication. Bernays worked for the Committee's Bureau of Latin American Affairs, helping distribute information and build support for the American war effort outside the United States. He later participated in publicity work connected to the Paris Peace Conference after the fighting ended. From a military perspective, Bernays had not commanded troops or planned battles. Yet he had witnessed another form of power. He had seen words turned into weapons. A government could take a population that had resisted entering a distant war and organize public opinion around sacrifice, patriotism, democracy, and fear. Newspapers could repeat the same themes. Experts could legitimize them. Public figures could reinforce them. Emotional images could make distant events feel immediate and personal. Most importantly, people could be guided without feeling that they were being ordered. They could be made to believe that the desired conclusion was their own. When Bernays returned to civilian life, he began asking a question with enormous consequences. If organized persuasion could unite a nation during war, why could the same techniques not be used during peace? Why could they not sell products? Why could they not improve the reputation of corporations? Why could they not change social customs, create new habits, promote political ideas, or redefine what Americans considered normal? The word propaganda had become associated with wartime deception and enemy governments. Bernays needed language that sounded more professional and less threatening. He increasingly presented himself as a counselor on public relations, a specialist who studied the relationship between institutions and the public. In 1919, he established his own public relations practice in New York. He was not the first person to advertise, organize publicity, or influence public opinion. Propaganda had existed for centuries, and other pioneers, including Ivy Lee, were already shaping the emerging public relations industry. Bernays' importance came from the way he attempted to systematize persuasion. He combined publicity with theories about group psychology, social behavior, authority, symbolism, and the unconscious. His office was not supposed to function like an ordinary advertising agency. Traditional advertising purchased space and delivered a direct message: buy this product. Bernays wanted something more powerful. He wanted newspapers to report stories that benefited his clients. He wanted doctors, professors, politicians, celebrities, community leaders, and social organizations to repeat ideas that appeared independent. He wanted public events designed in advance, but presented as genuine news. He wanted products connected to emotions that consumers might not fully understand themselves. The difference was subtle but profound. An advertisement told Americans what to buy. Bernays wanted to influence what Americans desired. During the 1920s, the United States was becoming the perfect laboratory for his ideas. Mass production was filling stores with automobiles, radios, packaged food, cigarettes, cosmetics, and household appliances. Companies could manufacture more goods than ever before, but producing those goods was only half the challenge. Americans had to be persuaded to purchase them. Practical need was no longer enough. A family did not require a new car every few years. A woman did not naturally need dozens of beauty products. A worker did not have to replace a functioning appliance simply because a newer model had appeared. The economy needed desire to expand faster than necessity. Bernays understood that businesses could not depend entirely on rational consumers carefully comparing price and usefulness. Corporations needed people to purchase symbols of success, freedom, attractiveness, status, masculinity, femininity, modernity, and belonging. His growing philosophy would later appear openly in his books, including Crystallizing Public Opinion in 1923 and Propaganda in 1928. In those works, Bernays described public opinion as something that could be studied, organized, and directed by specialists. His surviving papers, containing surveys, campaign materials, research notes, speeches, reports, and client records, show the extraordinary range of institutions that eventually employed these methods. Bernays believed mass society was too complicated for every citizen to investigate every issue independently. People depended on leaders, institutions, experts, and media organizations to reduce an overwhelming world into understandable choices. To Bernays, this system was not necessarily evil. He argued that persuasion could support public health, education, social reform, and democratic participation. A skilled public relations counselor, in his view, had obligations extending beyond the immediate interests of a paying client. In a 1928 discussion of his profession, he maintained that a counselor should not place loyalty to a client above responsibility to society. But there was an obvious danger hidden inside that argument. Who decided which goals benefited society? Who selected the experts? Who paid for the research? Who designed the public events? And how could ordinary Americans distinguish a genuine social movement from a corporate campaign built to resemble one? By the end of the 1920s, Edward Bernays was no longer simply a former wartime publicist. He was becoming an architect of a new commercial culture, one in which companies would not merely respond to public demand. They would manufacture it. And one of his most famous experiments would begin with a product that respectable American women were not supposed to use in public: a cigarette. Beauty and the American breakfast. On Easter Sunday morning in 1929, thousands of people gathered along Fifth Avenue in New York City. The annual Easter parade was not a military procession or an organized political demonstration. It was a public spectacle of fashion, wealth, religion, and social status. Men wore formal suits. Women appeared in carefully selected dresses and elaborate hats. Photographers moved through the crowd searching for images that could fill the following morning's newspapers. Among the women walking down Fifth Avenue was a small group carrying cigarettes. At a predetermined moment, they raised them to their lips, lit them, and continued walking. To the people watching, it appeared to be an act of rebellion. At that time, women could legally smoke, and many already did so in private. However, in much of respectable American society, a woman smoking openly on the street could still be judged as vulgar, immoral, or sexually improper. Men could light cigarettes almost anywhere without attracting attention. Women were expected to exercise restraint. The women in the parade appeared to be challenging that double standard. But the scene was not spontaneous. Edward Bernays had arranged it. His client was the American Tobacco Company, the manufacturer of Lucky Strike cigarettes. The company already sold enormous quantities of cigarettes to men, but half of the American population remained a largely restricted market. If the social taboo against women smoking in public could be weakened, the financial opportunity would be enormous. Bernays understood that a conventional advertisement would not be enough. A poster telling women to smoke could easily be dismissed as a corporation attempting to make money. The message needed to appear larger than the product. It needed to look like a movement. Bernays consulted psychoanalyst Abraham Brill about the psychological meaning of cigarettes. Brill suggested that women might view cigarettes as symbols of male authority and independence. From this conversation came the phrase "torches of freedom," connecting the act of smoking to women's liberation rather than to tobacco sales. Bernays then helped recruit a group of young women to participate in the Easter parade. Reporters and photographers were informed that women intended to light torches of freedom as a protest against inequality. The phrase was irresistible. It gave journalists a conflict, an image, and a social cause. The newspapers were not being asked to print an advertisement for Lucky Strike. They were being offered what appeared to be a story about women publicly demanding the same freedoms enjoyed by men. When the women lit their cigarettes, cameras were ready. The product became secondary. The photograph carried the message. A woman holding a cigarette was no longer simply consuming tobacco. She was presented as modern, independent, fearless, and unwilling to obey outdated rules. The campaign fused a legitimate demand for equality with the commercial ambitions of a cigarette manufacturer. That was the brilliance and the danger of Bernays' method. He did not create the women's rights movement. He recognized an existing social conflict and attached his client's product to it. He turned consumption into a public declaration of identity. The event later became one of the most famous stories in public relations history. However, historians examining contemporary records have warned that later accounts often exaggerated its immediate influence. The march involved a relatively small number of women, and the belief that a single publicity stunt suddenly transformed national smoking habits is difficult to prove. Its importance lies less in the number of cigarettes sold the following morning than in the strategy it represented. A corporation could place itself inside a social movement without appearing to advertise at all. For Bernays, the campaign demonstrated that products could be sold through emotional association. People did not need to be persuaded that a cigarette tasted better. They could be persuaded that it represented freedom. The same principle could be applied to food. During the 1920s, the beechnut packing company hired Bernays to promote its products, including bacon. The problem was straightforward. Americans were not eating enough bacon to satisfy the company. Bernays did not begin by creating advertisements praising its flavor. He looked for a way to redefine the American morning. At the time, many urban Americans ate relatively light breakfasts. Coffee, toast, fruit, or a roll could be enough before work. Bernays approached a physician and asked whether a substantial breakfast might be healthier than a light one. The doctor agreed and contacted thousands of other physicians seeking their opinions. Many supported the general idea that a hearty breakfast could be beneficial. Bernays now had something far more persuasive than a slogan. He had medical authority. The results were distributed to newspapers, which reported that physicians favored a heavier breakfast. Bacon and eggs appeared as the natural example of such a meal. Readers encountered the recommendation not merely as an advertisement from a meat company, but as health information supported by doctors. Beech nut remained in the background. The medical story moved to the foreground. The campaign helped strengthen the association between bacon, eggs, and the traditional American breakfast, an association that would become so familiar that later generations could easily assume it had always existed. Once again, Bernays was not simply selling a product. He was manufacturing a habit. The bacon campaign revealed a pattern that would become central to modern persuasion. A company had a commercial objective. An expert was consulted. A survey or statement was produced. Newspapers transformed the material into a story. The public encountered the conclusion through sources that appeared more trustworthy than the company itself. Each part of the process could be factually defensible. Doctors really had expressed support for a substantial breakfast. Bacon and eggs really did provide a heavier meal than coffee and toast. But the public was rarely shown the entire structure behind the message. They were not necessarily told that the campaign began with a bacon producer searching for higher sales. This distance between the client and the message gave public relations its power. Bernays used similar methods while working with Procter & Gamble to promote Ivory soap. Rather than telling children that they should enjoy bathing, he helped turn soap into a material for creativity. Children were invited to carve sculptures from white bars of soap. Schools, families, artists, and museums became connected to contests celebrating imagination and artistic expression. The activity generated newspaper coverage and public exhibitions while placing Ivory soap directly into the hands of children. The campaign continued for years and attracted widespread participation. A product associated with compulsory washing had been repositioned as a source of play, competition, and creativity. The child carving an animal from a bar of soap did not feel like the target of a corporate campaign. The parents reading about a school competition did not feel as though they were studying an advertisement. That was precisely the point. Bernays' campaigns often worked by creating circumstances in which people participated in the promotion themselves. Journalists wrote the stories. Doctors supplied authority. Teachers encouraged students. Social leaders attended events. Consumers carried the symbols into public life. The message appeared to rise naturally from society, even when Bernays' office had helped design the conditions that produced it. By the early 1930s, he had developed a sophisticated understanding of how American culture could be influenced through networks of authority. He did not need to control every newspaper or command every citizen. He needed to reach the institutions and personalities that shaped what others considered respectable, modern, healthy, or fashionable. Sometimes the challenge was almost absurdly specific. Lucky Strike cigarettes were sold in a green package. Company executives believed the color was recognizable and refused to change it. However, market research suggested that many women considered the shade difficult to coordinate with fashionable clothing. Bernays' first solution was the obvious one: change the package. The company refused. So he attempted to change American fashion instead. Bernays encouraged fashion editors, designers, retailers, artists, and prominent society women to focus attention on the color green. Luncheons, displays, discussions, and social events presented green as elegant and modern. The campaign culminated in a green ball at New York's Waldorf Astoria, organized publicly as a fashionable charity event rather than as an advertisement for tobacco. Lucky Strike was not placed at the center of the celebration. It did not need to be. If green became fashionable, the package would stop appearing unfashionable. Instead of changing the product to fit public taste, Bernays tried to change public taste to fit the product. That distinction captured the transformation taking place in American business. The industrial economy could produce goods on an unprecedented scale. Factories could manufacture more soap, food, clothing, automobiles, and cigarettes than consumers actually required. To keep expanding, corporations needed Americans to want things for reasons beyond practical necessity. Bernays offered a system for creating those reasons. A cigarette could become freedom. A color could become sophistication. A bar of soap could become childhood creativity. A plate of bacon could become a national tradition. Behind each transformation was the same psychological mechanism: connect the product to an emotion or identity more powerful than the product itself. Bernays openly argued that modern society was influenced by individuals and institutions capable of organizing public opinion. His papers, preserved by the Library of Congress, document decades of campaigns, surveys, reports, correspondence, speeches, and strategies created for corporations, governments, and public organizations. To his admirers, this was a necessary profession. A complex society needed specialists who could explain organizations to the public and help institutions understand public attitudes. To his critics, it created an invisible form of power. The public relations counselor could influence the news without appearing in it. A corporation could promote its interests through experts who seemed independent. A publicity stunt could disguise itself as political protest. A sales campaign could quietly reshape a cultural habit. Most Americans would never meet Edward Bernays. They would never enter his office, read his private correspondence, or hear the conversations in which commercial problems were transformed into social causes. They would simply encounter the results. They would open the newspaper and discover that doctors recommended a hearty breakfast. They would watch fashionable women wearing green. They would see children displaying soap sculptures in museums. They would witness women lighting cigarettes in the name of freedom. And they might believe that all of it had happened naturally. Yet selling breakfast and cigarettes was only one side of Bernays' growing influence. The same methods that could change consumer behavior could also protect powerful corporations, shape America's understanding of foreign governments, and turn commercial interests into matters of national security. In Central America, one of Bernays' most important clients owned vast plantations, controlled transportation networks, and feared a government attempting to reform the distribution of land. This time, the product being sold would not be bacon, soap, or tobacco. It would be a war against communism. By the late 1940s, Edward Bernays had already demonstrated that public opinion could be redirected through symbols, experts, staged events, and carefully selected information. He had helped sell cigarettes as freedom, bacon as health, and soap as creativity. But his work for the United Fruit Company revealed what could happen when those same methods were used not merely to sell products, but to shape American understanding of another country. United Fruit was one of the most powerful corporations operating in Latin America. It owned enormous banana plantations, controlled railroads and ports, and maintained deep political influence across the region. In Guatemala, the company was not simply a foreign business. Its economic power was so extensive that its interests were closely connected to the structure of the country itself. For decades, Guatemala had been governed by authoritarian leaders who protected large landowners and foreign corporations. Most rural families owned little or no land, while vast properties remained concentrated in the hands of a small elite. That began to change after the overthrow of dictator Jorge Ubico in 1944. A period of political reform followed. In 1951, Jacobo Arbenz became president. His government was not attempting to create a Soviet-style state. Arbenz presented himself as a nationalist reformer who wanted Guatemala to become more economically independent and socially modern. His most controversial policy was an agrarian reform program. The government planned to redistribute portions of large and used estates to landless farmers. Landowners would be compensated according to the value they had declared for tax purposes. For United Fruit, this created a serious problem. The corporation owned enormous areas of land in Guatemala, much of which was not actively cultivated. Like many large landholders, it had historically declared relatively low values for tax purposes. When the government used those same valuations to calculate compensation, United Fruit argued that the payment was far too small. The dispute was economic, but Bernays helped present it to the American public as something far more dangerous. It became a story about communism. The early 1950s were years of intense fear in the United States. The Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb. Communist forces had taken power in China. American soldiers were fighting in Korea. Senator Joseph McCarthy was making dramatic accusations about communist infiltration inside the federal government. In this atmosphere, the word communist could destroy reputations and end political careers. Bernays understood the emotional power of that fear. He organized trips to Guatemala for American journalists, arranged access to selected sources, distributed reports, and encouraged influential figures to view the country through the lens of the Cold War. Information emphasizing communist participation in Guatemalan politics was repeated, while the conflict over land reform and corporate property was often pushed into the background. The message was simple: Guatemala was becoming a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. It was a powerful narrative because it connected United Fruit's commercial interests to American national security. The average American did not need to understand Guatemala's land system, tax records, labor conditions, or domestic politics. The public only needed to believe that communism was moving closer to the United States. Bernays did not personally command soldiers, direct the Central Intelligence Agency, or make the final decisions in Washington. The overthrow of Arbenz resulted from a larger network of forces, including American officials, Guatemalan opponents of the government, Cold War strategy, corporate lobbying, and CIA covert operations. However, Bernays helped create a public atmosphere in which intervention could appear defensive rather than aggressive. In 1954, a small rebel force led by Carlos Castillo Armas entered Guatemala from neighboring Honduras. The military operation itself was limited, but it was supported by a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare. A CIA-backed radio station broadcast reports exaggerating the strength of the invading forces. Rumors spread that a major rebellion was underway. American aircraft carried out attacks and intimidation flights. The goal was not simply to defeat the Guatemalan military in open combat. It was to create fear, confusion, and the impression that resistance was hopeless. The strategy worked. Guatemala's army refused to fully defend Arbenz. Isolated and under increasing pressure, the president resigned in June 1954. Castillo Armas eventually took power, reversed the land reforms, and restored property to United Fruit and other large landowners. In the United States, the operation was presented as a victory against communism. But the consequences for Guatemala were devastating. The overthrow weakened democratic institutions and contributed to decades of dictatorship, political repression, and civil conflict. Guatemala's internal war, which began several years later, would last more than 3 decades and cost the lives of an enormous number of civilians, particularly indigenous communities. The public relations campaign had helped simplify a complicated country into a single frightening image: communism. That image concealed the farmers asking for land, the corporation defending its property, the local political conflicts, and the long-term consequences of foreign intervention. The Guatemala episode represented the darkest expression of Bernays' central principle: people could be guided most effectively when persuasion operated through emotions and trusted intermediaries. A corporation did not need to announce that it wanted the American government to protect its plantations. It could encourage journalists, officials, experts, and citizens to believe that protecting those plantations was necessary to defend the free world. Bernays remained active for many years and lived to the age of 103. During his lifetime, public relations grew from a loosely defined occupation into a global industry. Corporations created communications departments. Political candidates hired media consultants. Governments employed specialists in psychological operations. Advertising agencies adopted increasingly sophisticated methods for studying consumer behavior. The techniques became more advanced, but the basic structure remained familiar. Identify an emotion. Connect it to a symbol. Find an authority willing to repeat the message. Create an event that appears spontaneous. Encourage the media to distribute it. Hide the commercial or political objective behind a broader public cause. Bernays did not invent lies, propaganda, advertising, or political manipulation. Rulers, religious institutions, merchants, and military leaders had used persuasion for thousands of years. He also did not control every campaign later associated with his name. His importance was different. He helped professionalize the management of public opinion in modern American society. He offered corporations and governments a systematic way to influence people while preserving the appearance of independent thought. That appearance was essential. Obvious propaganda often creates resistance. People do not like being told they are being manipulated. They become defensive when a government orders them to believe something or when a company openly demands their loyalty. Bernays' methods were most effective when the message seemed to come from somewhere else. A doctor, a journalist, a celebrity, a scientific study, a women's movement, a charity event, a neighbor. Today, that principle appears everywhere. A company pays an influencer to praise a product while the recommendation is presented as a personal discovery. A political campaign tests thousands of messages to determine which fears produce the strongest reaction. Corporations sponsor research that supports their business interests. Public figures create apparently spontaneous moments designed in advance for cameras. Social media has made the system faster and more personal. Bernays worked with newspapers, radio programs, public events, and institutional leaders. Modern platforms can study individual behavior in real time. They can record which videos people watch, which headlines make them angry, which products they search for, and which political messages they share. Algorithms do not need to persuade everyone with the same idea. They can deliver a different version of reality to each person. A message can be tested on a small audience, modified within hours, and distributed to millions of users most likely to respond. Fear can be targeted. Insecurity can be monetized. Anger can be turned into engagement. The system is more powerful than anything Bernays could have operated from his New York office. Yet its psychological foundation would have been familiar to him. People rarely make decisions through pure logic. They respond to identity, status, belonging, anxiety, desire, authority, repetition, and social pressure. This does not mean every advertisement is evil or every public relations campaign is dishonest. Communication can promote public health, education, charitable work, and genuine reform. Bernays himself believed organized persuasion could serve constructive goals. The danger begins when the public cannot identify who created the message, who paid for it, and what outcome it was designed to produce. That is the central legacy of Edward Bernays. He did not discover that human beings could be influenced. He helped build an industry around the idea. He showed corporations how to turn private profit into public interest. He showed institutions how to make planned events look spontaneous. He demonstrated that the most powerful message was not always the one that demanded obedience. It was the one that made people feel free. The women holding cigarettes on Fifth Avenue believed they were displaying independence. The families eating bacon and eggs believed they were following medical advice. The Americans reading about Guatemala believed they were watching the advance of international communism. In every case, the public saw the visible message. Behind it stood an invisible structure of strategy, psychology, money, and power. Edward Bernays called that structure public relations. Today, it surrounds us.